All right, welcome back to the Hogtown Podcast, episode 51, with a returning guest, our friend Eric Lombardi.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here again.
What's changed since you were last on the show is people who know you as the founder of More Neighbours Toronto, which is kind of Toronto's YIMBY pro-housing group. I think when you were last on the show, you were a policy advisor to Bonnie Crombie during the last provincial election, and now you are exploring, I think is the right term, your own candidacy for Ontario Liberal Party leadership.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think if you followed my politics for a long time, I think you will have sensed that I've had a big frustration with provincial politics in Ontario, both from the fact that I do think Doug Ford is failing my generation and many of the people in Ontario, but also I see in the Ontario Liberal Party a huge opportunity to advance a debate that I think that we've been deprived of.
Yeah, so the last two leaders were Del Duca and Crombie. And, I think there were some good things in the Crombie platform, maybe largely due to the advisors she brought around her. But neither of them struck me as particularly thoughtful about these kind of like big questions that you've been touching on. And like, why is Ontario like the third poorest jurisdiction, or would be the third poorest state if it were American, or why have we been declining so much over the last 20 years? So it does seem like you're bringing, I don't know, a more kind of like a broader picture of where we've kind of gone off the rails and what you think are the right things to do to get us back on track.
And I think if we're being honest, right, one of the challenges in partisan politics is that people still feel attached to the legacies of when their government was in power last. And so I think it makes it very hard for a lot of partisans to admit that in Ontario, the fundamental challenge has not actually been in the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, but we've seen this broader trend towards stagnation and decline that
we have a nonpartisan problem.
Yeah, and I would actually say that a lot of the challenges in Ontario probably find their start in the 90s. Like I do think we haven't admitted that Canada's financial crisis then resulted in downloading and then re-downloading, and the institutional and long-term impact of a lot of these decisions have kind of culminated with our unwillingness to admit our deindustrialization.
Yeah.
And we kind of covered it up, I think, as we all shared this opinion, with a bit of a housing crisis and a bubble. And now we find ourselves in this state of, geopolitical turmoil, technological change. And we're finding that our systems, our institutions, our public services, our private economy, they're just not performing the way I think that we identify as a place. And to some degree, we've lost our, I'd say, like overall level of development.
I'm sure we're going to get deep, and there's no one better to go deep on some of these issues than you. But maybe to give people context, last year we had a provincial election. Doug Ford was reelected for a third majority government. Bonnie Crombie, as Chris mentioned, was a leader at the time. She's then since, I think there was sort of two steps. So she announced her intention to resign, and then ultimately she announced she was resigning because I guess the party wasn't getting its act together to like pull together the leadership rules. So we do have 4, let's say maybe 5 years of Doug Ford. So maybe call that 3 to 4 years remaining. The Liberal Party is going through a leadership race. There are a number of rumored candidates. I think everybody at this stage is sort of like unofficially a candidate. Can you talk a little bit about that slate of who the big names are, who people expect to be jumping into the race, and sort of where do you fit in that?
Yeah. Why did you think that was insufficient as a slate that you wanted to add your voice to it?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say the slate was insufficient. Okay. I would say that I think that this is among the best opportunities Ontario has for a serious debate about its future. And I'll talk about the slate, but it might make sense for me to also talk about the timeline and the rules.
Mm-hmm.
So the Liberal Party on the weekend of February the 7th released the rules for the race. Officially, anyone can register with Elections Ontario as of February 9th, but the official start date to the campaign from the party's perspective is going to be July 3rd. There's going to be a membership cutoff September 8th, extended to the 25th for students. And then the vote will take place between November 8th and November 20th, with results being provided on the 21st. And I think to some degree, if you're a candidate like me, I was preparing that it could be as soon as June. And so there is a decent length of time.
It is long in Canadian context.
And so I think even when we talk about the slate, I wouldn't be surprised if some names that are not currently committed to exploring also pop into the future. But some of those people I think are well known. Nate Erskine-Smith, he actually placed second to Bonnie in the last leadership race. He's been a federal MP for a decade. He had a very brief joint stint as the Minister of Housing, I think, for about 3 months in that sort of transition period.
Mhm.
And so he would be fairly well known. You have Lee Fairclough, who is the MPP for Etobicoke Lakeshore. She has a background as a CEO of a hospital, and she really does bring that perspective. And in my interactions with her, I actually think that she will be, I think, a formidable contestant in that.
Mm-hmm.
She's also a first-time MPP, as is Rob Serjanik, who I think many people who listen to this podcast might be familiar with. He was I believe the chief of staff to former deputy mayor Anna Bailão.
Yeah.
And has worked in the education sector for quite a bit of time. And so he got elected to be the MPP of Ajax. Then we have Mike Crawley. He was, I believe, I don't want to call it like the CEO, he might have been, or at least on the board of Northland Power. And so he's had a very long period of history with the party. He was the president of the LPCO in the rebuilding era around Justin Trudeau.
I picture him as the old guy. I can't find a photo of him online, so I just imagine he's been around the party for a while.
He's been around the party for a while, and he's built, I think, a lot of relationships within the party. I don't know necessarily what his public name recognition is, and that's certainly something that he'll have to work on.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Vikram Hanna, who I believe is a lawyer, and I think similar to me, is a candidate that is coming out from a little bit on the sidelines of the party. And I believe he'll probably have a bit of an agenda that he's looking to put forward as well.
And I think if I remember, and I don't follow this super closely, but I'm just trying to recall some of the headlines of rumored candidates that have said they're not interested. There was a Toronto-based MD, Andrew Buzari.
Andrew Buzari, yeah.
There was at one point a rumor around, I think, the mayor of Barrie, who's popular within liberal circles.
Jeff Lehman, and he's a great guy. I think there's some family health issues.
Right.
So I think as much as he would want to, I just don't think it's the right time for him.
Right. Got it.
And where would you place yourself within this mix? Like what sets you apart? I guess like what why would someone vote for you rather than all these, other impressive people?
I think because of all the campaigns, I think mine will be most focused on restoring economic growth and bringing back an affordable life in Ontario.
Right.
I do think that one of the biggest challenges that we have as a society is, let's call it like the overcomplexity of our systems has really undermined our ability to get productive growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that liberals are extraordinarily caring people, and I do think we sometimes miss the importance of growth to
prosperity.
To underpinning, like broadly speaking, like more optimistic sentiment in society. I do think that young people especially have taken the trade-offs of failed public policy for the last couple of decades. And I do think that overall, I'll bring a bit of an ethos that, while not necessarily more conservative, I think is more focused on the key functions of state. Whereas I think liberals have found ways to prioritize secondary and tertiary problems.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, the attitude of the campaign is going to be how we create more capacity and more production over how do we manage scarce resources more effectively.
Well, and if I would characterize you like really simply, it'd be sort of like a policy wonk with a lot of really thought out technical answers to really complex problems. I imagine that is both a strength and a weakness when you're trying to run for political office, where sometimes the average person in the audience is lost in the details. Like how do you see yourself, positioning yourself for like broad appeal?
I can't change the fact that fundamentally, like, I'm a nerd, and I care way too much about these issues, which is fundamentally why I've been interested in politics in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people can find nerdy affable sometimes, and so I think for me, it's just also allowing people to feel more comfortable. And I think I come across sometimes as a very serious person, but I can be ridiculous sometimes too. And so I think as the public gets to know me, they'll be able to feel a bit more comfortable. And I also have to learn how to speak to the right level, because when you are explaining, you're losing. And so if my message is simplification of our systems, well, then I also do think that my message needs to be simple too.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said is appealing to me. I assume appealing to Matt as long-term conservative voters or long-time conservative voters. You mentioned that not this conservative ethos, but more of a focus on growth, maybe than the typical liberal leadership candidate. what would be your pitch to conservatives specifically, like beyond what you've already said? Like, I guess this is why we voted for, I voted for Doug Ford the first two times, because he was saying basically a lot of the same things. Like, we've gone kind of off track with the McGuinty win stuff. Spending was too high, growth was too low. We needed to be open for business. That was the pitch. We've been pretty public about this on the podcast. We don't think that the pitch has been delivered.
No.
So is it just that, like, I will do what Doug Ford said he'll do, like I'll actually do it, or is there more of a nuance to like how you fit into Liberal Party as an example versus the Conservative Party and so on?
Like, I think what makes me more of a liberal than a conservative is that I do fundamentally believe that there is space for like the long-term collective approach to institution building that I think has been lacking in Ontario. And I think look at how we build out transit right now, where I think it's quite evident that if we had stronger expertise within public institution that was actually responsible for program managing the build out of public transit over a portfolio of projects like we see in the best instances of state capacity in like Europe and Asia. Like I think that there's a bit of a reflex that says no, like, more government won't be the right approach. But to me, my ethos is a little bit more, how do we prevent monopoly characteristics of anything in our society? And so for me, competitive markets are critical for when we're using them. And so I kind of take that lens on public policy. And I will say, like, I do want taxes to be lower. And frankly, under Kathleen Wynne, they were about 15% of GDP, and now they're about 16% of GDP.
Right.
So taxes are actually higher today under Doug Ford.
Because growth is lower. Yeah, right.
Because growth is lower. I do think that we probably have to have a lower baseline of taxes. But more importantly, I think we need a simplification of taxes. And so there are a lot of beneficiaries in how we design a complex system. But the broader benefit of a more competitive tax landscape might actually not result in us like collecting less taxes, but that the incentives that the tax system creates are healthier broadly in the economy. And so I'd say like my approach to some of this stuff might be more balanced in favor of continuing to make investments as a public system than I think, the same message that I would have to a more conservative audience.
Yeah.
That said, if you're a conservative and you just want good governance and you want fair and simple taxation and you want government that actually trusts people and businesses to drive an economy forward, and you do not like the type of graft and corruption that you're seeing specifically with this government, like I think you should feel very at home voting for myself.
When I guess that's part of the math, right? Like these things are just, at the end of the day, there's like a universe of voters that need to be appealed to. And there's some voters that like very, very strongly define themselves as liberals, conservatives, NDP. And then there's a large number of people that are just looking for good ideas and, a responsible leader. And, however you want to position that, I'm becoming more conservative or I'm becoming more liberal. I think that's been some of the criticism of Doug Ford is he tried too hard to appeal to part of the electorate that maybe conservatives don't like.
I also just happen to think that, I don't care if you're like NDP, liberal, or conservative. I think that we should all care that when we go to build like the Ontario line, for instance, it's $1.1 billion per kilometer. Half of it is above ground on an existing right of way. Like jurisdictions like Paris and Milan and Osaka are building fully automated underground metro systems for $350 million per kilometer. So I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. We should all care that when our government sets out to do things, that it does so making the best value for our money and that we're getting the most out of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that lens has been true for a very long time in Ontario.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think most normal people, we might not be normal, but most normal people like want a better life and a better life for their children and like less traffic and less, more take-home pay and so on. So I think that is very compelling. You talk about like a lot of the complexity that you say is kind of unnecessary benefits certain people. Like one of the things that you see in politics often is like good ideas go through the sausage making process of having input from every pressure group and constituency and come out on the other end. We use this term, everything bagel liberalism, where there's like a fig leaf thrown to all these, and that's where the complexity comes from. It's not because anybody wants, for example, subway construction to be 3 times higher than it is in Paris. It's because there are politically powerful pressure groups that benefit
Yeah.
from the state of affairs. How do you resist that, or how do you even think about that to maintain this pitch of like a simpler, more common sense approach to governance, if that means annoying all the people that benefit from the complex, expensive form of governance that we have now?
I think fundamentally there's really only one voter. And at the end of the day, when you add lots of voices to processes that are outside of the interests that the people voted for, I think you actually undermine broader trust. So we talk about housing a lot, and we have these very time-consuming processes around like public consultation, et cetera, for new housing. And I don't think that having all this process has actually led to increasing public trust in the development industry or the system. In fact, I think it's indicated to people that there's far more discretion.
And we do it in the name of democracy, but frankly, it's often the opposite, because you're taking what is an electorally, approved mandate, and then you're putting it through this like special interest process that detracts from that, right?
Yeah. Like, even like getting back to the Ontario line as an example, on almost every site that we're building a station, you actually have to start with like a year or two long archaeological assessment. And it's like, I actually don't know if that step and time consumed is really worth the delay and the extra cost, because it's
it's not.
it's not just the cost on site, but it's that you're ramping up these programs at the like higher organizational level. And I think we don't appreciate that value is not creating what I would call like long-term benefit. Like what we want as a society when we're building infrastructure is to take our income and turn it into capital, because capital is not money. Capital is like machinery, goods, etc., that have an ability to ongoing produce income and wealth. And so when we see, particularly in Ontario, over the last 20 years, in 2005, about 70% of the cost of building housing and infrastructure actually went to the hard cost of building housing and infrastructure. I think, depends on the study you look at, but it's not more than 50 today. In fact, in many cases, it's probably closer to 40%. So we've allowed this sort of cottage industry tax to both extend the timelines and the costs of what it takes to do things. And then the outcome is people actually lose trust. And so I think if you make the case to voters that actually we're going to make sacrifices, but the outcome is going to be that things get done faster for less cost, and therefore we'll be able to do more of it, that's actually the recipe for improving public trust in the system and process in general. And that means we need rule of law to take precedence over some of these other things.
It is one of these things that I think often gets missed, and this isn't purely provincial, but even when we look at some new federal policy under Mark Carney, things like Build Canada Homes, where there's like, big dollar amounts being thrown around to, in certain cases are going to be building subsidized housing units, et cetera. I think what often gets missed is that like the cost to deliver a unit of transit, a kilometer of underground line, or a unit of housing, in and of itself is a headline. But what often gets missed in the headline is how many units could we have built? Right. Because we build 1 kilometer of transit for $1.1 billion. That sounds awful, but we have no point of reference other than maybe saying we could have built 3 kilometers of transit for that money, right? Like, or we could have built double the housing units for the money that we put into housing. And I think there's not enough emphasis or highlight put onto that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even when we look at, because we all have a bit of a background in housing, I think some of the math is underappreciated even by the province, in some of the solutions that we need would actually generate probably just as much, if not more, tax revenue. Like, I think if you look at the provincial tax wedge, if the province was actually meeting its housing goals, it would be generating enough new income tax. Like HST from spending in the economy and all the downstream effects of that economic
property
activity.
Taxes for municipalities.
But like even just ignore that. Is like you could replace almost the entirety of development charges by just having more housing being built in general. And a lot of those charges are for indirect infrastructure like parks and libraries and all this other stuff. And so it's like, okay, guys, actually solving the problem
creates
almost
revenue.
Pay for itself if you do it properly. And because we're in this zero-sum mindset in Ontario where we do not believe growth is viable, we don't even govern with the attitude that growth will drive benefit. One person I almost blame for all of this is when Trudeau got elected, he said like the budget will balance for itself, like growth will pay for growth. More or less that's true. you had
Don't
to
make that your
have
campaign slogan.
you had to have a productivity focus in the
Yes.
government
Yeah.
on growth. What we saw is that was used more as a slogan rather than like an ethos of governance.
Yeah.
And now people, I think, when they hear that, yeah, like if our economy grows, we can pay for it. Like I've heard that story before, and it's like, no, that you were told that story before. No one
You haven't
executed
seen
that
it. Yeah,
story. You have not seen it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to joke that the two things Trudeau said that were most controversial to conservatives were the budget will balance itself, and he admired China's effectively state capacity. And I'm like, those are the two things I actually like most about him. He wanted to focus on growth and state capacity. Of course, he didn't actually focus on growth and state capacity, but I take your point. You could have done this. You could have applied these ideas and thoughts once again as an advisor to an existing candidate. You chose instead to run for leader, or at least you're exploring this idea of running for leader. What do you think the big difference here is in terms of actually being able to deliver on it? Like what can an advisor not do that a leader can, and why is that worth all the, I'm sure, heartache and time and money you're putting into this?
I think fundamentally, if I have a message that I think is going to get missed in the debate, I shouldn't try to depend on someone else to make that decision for me. And what my fear was entering this campaign is that growth and the economy and fundamentally understanding what's gone wrong is not going to be a part of the debate in the way that I would like for it to be. I also do think that, broadly speaking, I am a Toronto guy, but this race is looking very Toronto-centric.
Right.
And I do think part of the challenge...
In terms of the slate of candidates?
In terms of the slate of candidates. Yeah. And I think that fundamentally misses just how bad the last 25 years have been in a lot of different parts in Ontario.
Yeah.
Like I was talking with a stakeholder in Thunder Bay, and people don't realize, like, they went from having, I think, 6 pulp and paper mills active in that area 30 years ago to just 1.
Right.
And yes, like we've allocated more public services there, etc. But the lack of connectivity and investment in these places has actually really meant that a lot of industries, particularly private industries that gave good employment and things that people could build their lives on, have really diminished. And the cover up that we saw in like areas like the GTA around housing, well, they didn't make it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Or even like in Windsor. Windsor has a lower real income today than it did 25 years ago,
right.
When adjusted for inflation. But its housing prices have gone from a 3-to-1 ratio to income to almost 10-to-1 ratio.
Right.
And I don't think that just how bad this is and how it happened is really well understood, not just within the Ontario Liberal Party, but I think within Ontario at large. And I think people feel decline, they see it. But fundamentally, I want to make the case and provide the explanation as to how we came here, and then what does it mean to change.
Right.
And so I don't know if another candidate is going to do that message the way that I would like to. And I think that makes my campaign differentiated within the context of this race, because I'm not a practiced politician. I've not spent years trying to understand exactly how to angle the right bits into the right places. I'm here because I have a purpose-driven agenda to tell the Ontario Liberal Party the agenda needs to be the economy, it needs to be growth, and it needs to be like institutional rehabilitation of our government.
Right. So let's talk about growth. So when I hear these two stories about Thunder Bay and Windsor, to me, the obvious easy thing is like we should make it easier to build housing in Toronto where there are good jobs so that people could like leave these low productivity regions to a much higher productivity region. I don't know if that like sells in Thunder Bay and Windsor. Like what are some like big themes of like your big theme is let's get growth back on track. How do we get growth back on track? Like what are big...
Yeah, actually, particularly I'm interested in the outside of Toronto or outside of the GTA angle to that, because there's, two very different stories in Ontario, right?
So fundamentally an economy is about the most efficient movement of goods, people, ideas, and resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're looking at like rural and northern Ontario, these are places that are, number one, they're facing our demographic future earlier.
Yeah.
They're aging faster. They're the ones who've been really hit by deindustrialization pretty hard.
Meaning young people are leaving in larger numbers?
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things that are in my mind is connecting these places better to each other and to other population centers also creates greater incentive for additional industry to locate there. Many of these places have a lower cost of living. And so when you have industries that are more permanent, people can build their lives around their jobs in these places. And so I don't think it like inherently is just like, well, if we just make it easier for them to leave, then that's like all fine and dandy. These places want a future and they also just
and there are industries that need to be located near resources, right? When there's lumber or minerals or whatever, you have to be where the lumber and the minerals are, right? So
and, we do have a lot of provincial institutions that I think are long-term, they are enduring, and they require people to become skilled for a lifetime to do that well. And so I do think that there's opportunities to drive economic development around locating more of these things in these places. But I think first and foremost is increasing the connectivity between these places and other population centers in Ontario is inherently good for mobility and therefore productivity.
More rail, more highways, more airports.
Yes. So you like the Northlander train?
I do like the Northlander train. And, this might be one of my more socialist opinions. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. But I think one of the worst public policy mistakes that we've made is when we sold off our public railways and specifically our corridors. In many ways, we actually lost the capacity to run higher quality rail services because they're secondary.
Right.
Like people like to complain about VIA.
Yeah.
But like a big part of the challenge with VIA is that they don't actually own a lot of the tracks anymore. And so they're
second priority behind CN trains and CP trains, right?
Yeah. And so, like, for instance, when I think about like connecting the north, we actually do have rail that goes all the way from Toronto with like stops in like Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay. So I think about a lot, like, how do we actually leverage what we have there to run services that make it easier for people to get to and from these places? And what does that mean? It means if you're an industry, well, that connectivity back to the population centers actually makes it more interesting for you to set up in a place like this than the base case before.
Right.
And so when you think about, anything, I kind of think about you're nudging in certain directions. And I think there's a lot of ways a province can nudge the incentive towards investing in these places without necessarily being picking winners and losers. You're picking like infrastructure and inputs into trade and mobility that benefit these places.
Right.
And then you're co-locating investments you'd otherwise be making anyways as a public sector in these places, particularly when it makes sense that they're going to be longer term. And
I have a very specific question because I can't say I've thought enough about it to have a strong opinion, but every time the city of Toronto announces a new public transit project, we often hear of the actual rail cars getting built in Thunder Bay, if I'm not mistaken. That to me feels like a great example of like the challenge of politics where objectively there's probably a cheaper place to build or buy streetcar cars.
Yeah.
But there's like an economic investment case to be made for a place in the province that's maybe needing a little bit of love. How do you think about those types of political trade-offs? Because on the one hand, that is probably in the purest economic sense, not like a pro-growth approach, but it's like sort of like spreading the love.
Like another example would be, you may or may not remember the feed-in tariff program under McGuinty and then Wynne, where they wanted to incentivize more solar and wind, but let's say solar rollout. The only reason solar had become cost competitive was because of Chinese manufacturing, but this program required CanCon assembly, like Canadian production, which basically like undermined the economic case for solar in the first place. So to Matt's point, these kind of like conflicting mandates.
I think when it comes to industrial policy, and by the way, on March 3rd, I'll actually be doing a event with Joseph Steinberg, who's a University of Professor Prof.
University of Toronto
professor in economics, and we're going to be talking about corporate subsidies and industrial policy and how you do these things right and how you do these things wrong. It's like using the Alstom case in Thunder Bay. These are great jobs and they also do support additional supply chains in that area, and the infrastructure does exist there already. What I don't like about the way that we do deals, and this is going to be a harder thing to talk about, is when it comes to industrial policy or subsidies, when we talk about like the Chinese model for this, for instance, they don't subsidize production and they don't subsidize jobs. They subsidize the capital to produce more of a thing at a better price point. I think we've become very bad at doing that. And so like what I don't like about the Alstom deal is not that we made the investment, but that when you look at the actual cost of the cars that we're producing, they end up being 20 to 30% more expensive than a lot of others provided elsewhere. And there is a truth that these cars are made for Canada. Like our subway systems have above ground and outdoor parts and indoor parts, and a lot of other manufacturers, we've seen that their cars are not as fully tested. Like if you look at like Ottawa's
LRT,
train, for instance, that were not these Alstom ones from Thunder Bay.
Yeah.
And so there is a truth that like these cars are truly tested for us. But the question to me would have been like, what investments do we need to make in the process to bring down the cost of producing these as well? I didn't like what we did where we just said we're buying 55. I actually think what you could do is you could drive down your long-term costs if the model was closer to we're buying 10 or 15 of these cars, extra cars every year for ever. And that actually allows everyone involved, including the folks who work at Alstom,
make long-term investments.
To make long-term investments and bets on their careers. And so what I don't like is when we do like industrial policy is that we don't think about systems and we don't think about capital over and productivity as the goal of the investment.
Yeah.
And so I think the outcomes for workers would be almost entirely the same in this new model. But because the deal is easier on these like one-off agreements, everyone kind of pisses on the same fire hydrant and everyone's happy and merry. And I think that's what fundamentally needs to change in our mindset. So it's not a no to these kind of things, but it's what are we actually trying to accomplish for the long term, and how do we make investments that set us up for that to be enduring?
Right.
And tell us why, again, we're coming at this as PC voters. So there's ways to do industrial policy smarter and less smart. Why industrial policy in addition to, let's say, just tax cuts and deregulation? Like what additional thing are you looking to solve here?
I mean, I think when it comes to, so I'd say like the third part is restoring state capacity, right? Like I do think that regardless of what system we're looking at, I do think people broadly feel like they're not performing at the level that they were before. And I think that that's partially a technology challenge. Like I actually do think that we have broadly underinvested in technology and public sector productivity. I also do think it's a mandate problem. I want to change many of our institutions from being, let's call it regulators, to builders. I know we talk about planning a lot, and I think to some degree, there's actually a case to be made that many of our problems are actually due to underplanning.
Like land use planning, yeah.
Or even like infrastructure planning.
Sure.
Like if we had a long-term plan for, let's call it like rail construction, and we in-house standards, designs, etc., and we did all the pre-permitting, even like well before we need to actually get to building the thing. I think the actual timelines for delivering it would actually compress. There's even models where you have the permitting almost already done and you've done the work up front to buy in all the consensus from all the stakeholders. Well, then you've de-risked it from even potentially like a pension fund saying, you know what, we want to privately build this model. We have a clear public subsidy model per kilometer, and this is already approved. So we're going to take it up and build it because we're allowed to.
Right.
And I think the same is true in energy and a lot of other areas as well. And so to me, that's a state capacity challenge because you're actually fundamentally seeking your institutions to not become regulators of growth, but builders who are responsible for growth in their own right.
Right.
And that's like a mindset shift that has to happen.
And I think I got this from you, in fact, at an event we were at together a few weeks ago. You made the comment, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, so you can correct me, that Canadian pension funds own these types of infrastructure projects in almost every developed country in the world, except for Canada, right? They own rail lines, they own ports, they own airports, they own, whatever, highways in some cases. I mean, obviously we've got the 407, which is controversial in its own right. But for whatever reason, they refuse to make these investments in Canada, not because our infrastructure is any worse, just because there's a lot less certainty, predictability. There's a lot of politics around infrastructure. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the fundamental thing is when you're making an investment, you want to have a risk-adjusted rate of return that you are comfortable in as part of your mandate as an institution. And so when there's so much complexity in Canada, that complexity actually lives up front.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the permitting process. It's in all the cottage industry tax and the soft costs that make projects unreliable.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the fact that even if they were built, we would never allow private entity, even if that private entity is still public entity in some ways, like a pension fund, to own it. And so, you've seen this discussion, well, should our pension funds be investing more in Canada? And to me, that's not the question. Like, there shouldn't be a mandate that we give it. They're
like, why are they not? Yeah.
It should be telling us, why aren't they investing more in Canada? And the answer for that is, I think, we don't allow them to own the types of assets
that fit their return profile
that they like to own.
Yeah.
So like if you look at like the UK, for instance, like pension funds own several of the major airports in London.
Right.
We see that they own highways, they own like subway lines like across the world. Right. I think even like Copenhagen's airport is owned by a Canadian pension fund. Would we ever allow them to do that here? No, of course not. And so we can't get angry that we're not seeing more investment from our pension funds in Canada when we don't allow them to invest in the kind of things that they like to own.
The opposite mindset of like mandating a certain amount of Canadian investment just leads to poorer performing pension funds.
Yes.
Because you're not solving the root issue.
Retirees.
But you're forcing them to invest in like lower performing assets. Right.
Like, so nothing scares me more than a politician saying, hey, maybe we need to have an Invest in Canada mandate for
without solving the problem.
I'm like, oh God, no, like that sounds like a terrible idea. Yeah. Like what we should be doing is, what does it take to get them to be investing like half of their assets here? Because
so Eric Lombardi for privatizing highways, subway lines, and airports.
I would actually say I'm not for privatizing the ones that we currently have. Like let's go to the 407 as an example. The reason why the 407 can charge such a premium is that it's the only highway in the GTA that you can reliably go east to west in a predictable amount of time.
Totally.
To me, the question is, well, how do we get more east-west arterials built? Like, I don't think that saying, hey, we're going to put a major toll on the 401 is a vote winner.
A tunnel on the 401?
I don't think we'll do a tunnel, but my question is, like, how do we get more east-west routes in general? And then, yes, like, there might be some cases for, like, how do we use pricing better? But I think fundamentally, if you tell people you're going to tax their commute, when you've designed a system and infrastructure around that commute being free, people perceive that to be unfair. And I actually think that that is largely true.
Yeah.
Like public systems need to be designed for predictability over the long term. And in many ways, the fact that we've become like over-regulated and over-litigious in how we do things has actually gone us away from predictability. And so if I value predictability because it's valuable for people to have, then like you can't just like pull their like a cap over their eyelids and say, well, do you know what, the prediction that you made about your commute is totally false now.
Right.
Can I draw a parallel? And I want to pull you into a topic where I know we'll probably disagree. The 407 to the 401 to me is a perfect analogy to the arguments made for a two-tier healthcare system historically, that you've got a public option. It's sometimes got gridlock on it. It's sometimes unpredictable. And don't worry, there's an option where you can pay for the certainty of getting across the city east to west.
Yeah. Which in turn takes you out of the queue for the public option. Takes you out of the queue
on the public option. And so you mentioned earlier this idea of like, you want to be able to view the economy, whether, the government's role in it or the private economy, as sort of eliminating monopolies where they exist.
Yeah.
I think of two obvious places in provincial politics. I think of the healthcare system, the education system, where there's, at least in Ontario, been this sort of like allergic reaction to ever thinking through those systems from a competitive perspective. I know you've got a nuanced take on this, so maybe you can, let's start with healthcare. Like how do you, like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are the tools that we're willing to entertain? Yeah. And I suspect there's a need for a certain amount of trial and error, and be open about there's a need for trial and error without, these political third rails. So how do you think about healthcare, and like, how do we get through that?
I mean, I think fundamentally in healthcare, like, we do just need more doctors and more nurses and more focus on frontline capacity. Fundamentally, that will cost money. I do also believe that, look, like, I think that there is a level of frustration in the debate about healthcare in Canada, but I do think that Ontarians, by and large, they want to see the public system work. And I think it's harder to even make a case for private healthcare when the by and large feeling is that the underinvestment and unwillingness to change in the public sector is partially being done so that it's undermined enough that people want to see private healthcare. And I do buy parts of that argument. That said, I do think that we ignore sometimes the power of good incentives and pricing.
Mhm.
I just think that some of those issues are in how we actually manage the healthcare sector in the first place. So I'll give you a couple of examples on this. I was talking to someone, and they're like a cataract surgeon in southwestern Ontario, and their clinic actually came up with a new method to do more surgeries than before. And so their billables in 1 year went from like 600,000 to like 1.5 million. And instead of the province saying like, hey, this innovation is great, like we could roll it out and do way more, they said, you're billing us too much.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, okay, I guess I'm only working 2.5 days a week.
Doing less surgeries.
Doing less surgeries. And so to me, it's like, well, if we find novel ways to do things faster in our healthcare system, then maybe the way that we actually set pricing for procedures says like, and by the way, like don't hold me to this.
Sure.
This is more like a mental framework.
Yeah.
Is if we're getting improvements from physicians in how they're delivering some services, then we should look at our cost for those services, divide by the number that they can do, and we might actually allow for the price paid to a physician to do a certain service to go down year over year.
Right.
And we actually don't allow that to happen. And so to me, what that doctor should have wanted to do is, like the price for cataract surgeries is going down because there's been innovations to make them cheaper and faster. But now I still want to maintain my market share or grow it.
So I want to grow.
And so then that challenges other surgeons to adopt similar methods, etc. And so when you have like pricing systems and models for compensation that in many ways create rigidity and disincentives towards innovation, well, that's also a problem. But that problem exists in the public sector. And so I think when we think about markets and competition, I think that there are ways that we can bring some of these principles and apply them for better outcomes in the public system. I think the same is true if you look at like MRIs and CT scans. If you go to get an X-ray or an ultrasound, a lot of these clinics are privately operated but publicly paid.
Recent, I think that's fairly recent.
Like I'll say, like I've had to have a couple of those in the last few years, and finding appointments for like an ultrasound clinic, like you can often do it the same week, or like the next week.
Yeah.
But if you want to get an MRI or CT scan, it takes often months unless you're in an urgent position. And if you want to do that fast, you have to go to the ER.
Yeah.
And so we actually have some of these examples and models. And so I think part of it is just the stubbornness and lack of curiosity to change. And so like when I think about how do we improve our healthcare system, I want to start with like, there are known things we're doing badly today that could actually make things more productive. I do want to give one more example, and that's on data.
Yeah.
Despite having like a program around eHealth Ontario operating for a very long time, we still see that, reliance on faxes, different hospitals and different networks often do not have connected systems. We are seeing that improve. But then you're spending a lot of time, for instance, on validating people's medical and patient history, which for many, they might not know everything. And so you'll even see doctors and nurses having to repeat ask. They have to go contact their former clinical care providers and then fax details and information. A lot of these challenges can be solved by clear investments in technology and a willingness to say that some processes need to change in order to accommodate this path. And because we haven't been willing to make those trade-offs and actually push for it, we end up spending more money on managing work that technology could have made us more productive in solving.
Not healthcare workers, but administrative workers having to spend time in a fax machine.
Right? And then, you create all these weird disincentives towards doing good things. Like family physicians, we say we don't have enough of them, but they are buried in paperwork.
Yeah.
And like if their patient goes to a walk-in clinic, they're penalized for that. Like this is scarcity politics.
Yeah.
And so when I look at the healthcare sector, like any other sector, like could we talk about more choice? Potentially, but I don't think people are willing to have that conversation when we haven't tried with our public system in the first place. So that's what my focus is going to be.
Yeah, maybe as a follow-up, because I think, again, like this whole idea that like normal people, I think of things differently. Like, I could go to a Juneau veterinary clinic, next week and get my dog treated, but I can't do the same for an MRI. And if I think about any American state, including Democratic states, including like long-term Democratic states like California, I could pay for an MRI and I got to go get an MRI, and I might get a smoothie with it. It'll be a great service. And, like, do normal people like say, let's hold off on that until we really give public a shot, after like 50, 60, 70 years of public? Like, what's the best, just on diagnostics, because I think it's maybe like the simplest version of this, what's the best reason for maintaining a ban on me paying for an MRI and basically forcing me to go to like Buffalo to get MRI?
I don't think I would actually say that. I don't think that there should be some more flexibility in private diagnostics. I think that would relieve a lot of capacity issues. I actually think that the answer is yes and.
Sure.
So we certainly need more MRIs and CT scanners. And actually, previous bottleneck to a lot of this was having enough radiologists.
Yeah.
But because of like machine learning and image analysis, we are actually seeing our capacity for those same radiologists. We don't need fewer radiologists. We actually need them to be reviewing more work.
Yeah.
Because that work is now becoming aided by really advanced technology.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I want to see us invest in MRIs and CT scanners as a public. But I also do think that there are a lot of discretionary health services that people already consume privately.
Totally.
And I even think that there are probably ways to incentivize people to consume more health services. And I actually do think one of the challenges is by having no pricing mechanisms at all, you actually disincentivize people spending more on preventative healthcare in some ways. And so I don't think about this as like you should all pay for that, but I actually do think that, hey, if you do go to see your family physician once a year for a physical and do some upfront diagnostic testing that might allow us to catch problems earlier, the chances are that that is going to save us money.
Yeah.
So how do we incentivize you to go do that? And so I don't know if the answer is like giving people a discretionary budget with their health card every year. I don't know if that's like tax benefits if they do these things. But I actually think that thinking about pricing mechanisms that incentivize good behavior is a very worthwhile thing to do, even in the context of the public sector.
Right.
But what I don't want to see happen, and I think there's like a fundamental feeling of unfairness, is that you see this huge paradigm between private, where you could, go get a foot surgery in 2 weeks, and if you're waiting in the public line, it's 2 years. And I think people feel that is a fundamentally unjust thing.
Yeah.
And so to me, I think if we're going to make the case ever to go to this two-tiered model, people have to be convinced that it's not at the expense of the public system in the long term.
I think this is definitely like to move on a little bit from healthcare. I think this is one of the challenges that I find in liberal politics is this like trade-off of sort of like the wealthy and everyone else, and policies that are perceived to be very favorable to like a higher echelon of society. Let's take housing as an example. Pierre Poilievre ran in the last federal election on the idea of like killing the capital gain on reinvested capital. Mark Carney ran on the idea of reintroducing the MERB incentive. These things could both very easily be characterized as like pro-rich people policies, but in fact unlock the economic activity needed to solve the problem for everybody else. But naturally, the like headline is always the worst possible characterization of like, well, here goes a conservative, or in the MERB context, a liberal politician wanting to like reintroduce.
MERB, he hasn't done it, and maybe for this reason,
And I suspect it's one of the reasons he hasn't done it, because it probably polls poorly to say, hey, here's a tax credit for rich people.
Yeah.
But that study after study and all the evidence would point to the fact that would unlock an enormous amount of housing.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe we could talk specifically about housing, but also how do you think about that general risk? Because to me, sometimes like to build more housing, somebody has to get rich. And like, it's an awful thing to say politically, but like the guy who built it and the landlord is going to make more money than the tenant. Like that's so, but you have to be able to address that politically, right?
More broadly, economic growth and to attract talent. Like if I'm a rich guy choosing between New York, LA, and Toronto, I might not hinge the whole decision on whether I could get an MRI, when I want an MRI, but like it's part of it. Like does the system like appeal to me as a rich guy?
Well, I mean, I fundamentally believe that like, and this is what I actually think liberalism is the belief in competitive markets and creative destruction driving investment and income growth and wealth production in the economy, that we should tax as efficiently as possible to pay for robust and generous welfare to live in an advanced and humane society.
Yeah, that's quite the definition. That is a pretty comprehensive definition.
That to me is fundamentally what liberalism is about. What I don't like, and I think you've heard this, is like, I do not like when people make money off of rent seeking.
Sure.
So if what you're doing is like, hey, like I'm creating capital, like I'm building homes, like that's where I want you to get wealthy. I don't want you to get wealthy, for instance, on, hey, do you know what? I'm buying this plot of land. It's underdeveloped. Therefore, the property taxes are low. There's land scarcity in the GTA, and I'm going to hold this for the next 20 years because I believe that that's going to return me more.
Sure.
And so I think people can tell the difference between like when they're getting taken advantage of and someone's profiting on their expense versus when someone has done something innovative and deserves to have windfall from their risk and effort.
Right.
And so like, I like to distinguish these two things in my mind as well. And so my answer to you is yes, like my hope is that our economy is generating growth that is making lots of people wealthier, but also that wealth is creating dynamism and demand for labor and all these other things that broadly makes everyone else wealthy too. I don't know if that answered your question exactly.
Yeah, I mean, like one observation, and I don't have data to back this up, but anecdotally, from what I observe or see in the context of like your average American state, is you have a lot more people wealthy in sort of the middle category, where you've got a lot of people worth like $10 to $50 million.
Yeah.
Because they started a dry cleaning business that opened 7 locations, or because they used to run a car wash that got very successful.
Yeah.
And you just see a lot less of that in Canada. Not the like multi-billionaire. You can have all the criticisms of Galen Weston or whoever you want, but like we sort of have this absence of like the aspiration, the very realistic aspiration that being wealthy is feasible. It's welcomed. In fact, it's celebrated and encouraged. It just seems like our narrative, our political messaging always sort of puts these people in like a negative light. I mean, I remember Justin Trudeau talking about dentists as being effectively tax evaders, right? Like because their businesses were getting successful. And I'm sure there's nuance to that, but like that seems to be the like overwhelming political incentive, is to sort of like cast these people as negative.
That's because we're in a zero-sum economy, and we have been for a long time. Like if you look at Ontario, we have about half the new business formation per capita than we did 25 years ago. And, I don't think that this argument is going to be a mystery to you guys, but if you want people to start businesses and feel, first of all, there needs to be a broader sense of optimism. But number two is the age group most likely to start a business is 25 to 45. Like that's when most new business formation occurs. And so what we've seen happen in Ontario is because of both stagnant incomes and the housing crisis, is that more of people's income goes towards housing and therefore rent and interest, which are in many ways unproductive forms of spending. And then they've had less discretionary income after both taxes
to take risks
and housing. And so that means that you're generating less savings.
Yeah.
It means that you have less risk capacity because you need more savings in order to do so. And therefore, the likelihood of people feeling optimistic about their future or even having the capacity to start a business is not there. And a lot of this also just ties into the milestone recession where, I think in the past, people want to hit certain points in their life before they feel comfortable doing things. So I think in the past, like, if you're able to get your financial footing by the time you were 24, and then you got married around 26, 27, you started having kids, you kind of hit your 30s and you've figured out your responsibilities, you've gotten some footing in your career financially, you've got your home, your family life sorted. And now it's like, okay, like what's next in my journey of self-actualization? And that's when you get people starting businesses and being more aspirant in these ways, like they're legacy building for their families. And so to me, fixing our problem of generating all these new businesses and new wealth, it's got its root in both this challenge around the milestone recession, but then also just the overburdening regulation that makes it really hard for new entrants to enter many of the sectors that we have to begin with. And so fundamentally to me, I want to fix those things. And I almost think that this issue around wealth creation and new business formation, it'll be downstream of that. And I think governments who think that, they can just grant their way into a better economy by picking winners, it doesn't work. So I think if we focus on the fundamentals of getting people's lives so they have more disposable income and risk-taking capacity, and we focus on our key public systems like education, healthcare excellence, transportation, all these things, you create the space for everyone to build everything else.
Yeah.
You're a young guy. You've worked in tech. If we project out to the next election, let's say that's 3 to 4 years, most AI timelines have like all work on computer being automated at that point. And like, I guess there's like two implications and you could quibble. You could say maybe that's a few years further out, but like at least some very credible, like big AI lab leaders say that like computer use is the next big thing with these models. And if you project out 3 to 4 years and you just kind of like extrapolate the current trend, at least a lot of what humans do on computers should be done by AI. How do you think about that generally? This seems like a totally under-discussed domain in politics, period, which is insane to me. It's like COVID times 100 and nobody's talking about it, both in terms of the opportunity, especially the opportunity in state capacity and running a more efficient government, and maybe like the need for more dynamism and flexibility because there will be a lot of changes in the labor market and employment and so on.
I have a lot of thoughts on this subject. I think, there's first the opportunity, and then I think there's the mindset I find to be kind of funny in this area. Look, I will say that I do find that some of the tech leaders in this space who are like dooming, I think that there's a lot of incentive to kind of create this hype because then it attracts capital because they think, oh, like all these things and the change is going to happen. I have to be in early. I think that there's probably in technology spaces, and I work in finance as well, just as much as I do in technology. I think the stickiness of human institutions and processes is more sticky than they realize, and that a lot of the reason why roles exist is because human relationships and trust actually matter in the economy, and it's not super easy just to replace that with AI doing stuff. I also do think that you have a challenge around distribution. So like even if you're a SaaS company, like you are still oftentimes, especially B2B, building relationships with customers that have customer service components, like best knowledge components. I think there's a level of overestimation in how fast a lot of industries can adopt this technology, to the extent that like go look at like supply chain industries. Like if you look at like that middle sector of like your small distributor, your medium-sized distributor, you'd be shocked at how low technology penetration is today. And so, I think the speed and pace of change, I think the models are going to get very far.
But the diffusion, you say, will be
I think the
longer.
diffusion will be slower.
But even taking the capabilities, because within government as premier, you could accelerate diffusion. Would you? And in which ways?
Like I think like before we just talk about AI in government, we should just talk about digital and technology in government. Like not even from an AI perspective, but that we need to invest in the modernization of our technology systems to be more productive.
Right.
And AI can certainly help us do that faster.
Yeah.
But then I think about both in government and even the private sector. Yes, like could you lay people off? Of course. But nothing is going to be as productive. AI is not going to be as productive as AI paired with humans using AI will be. And so when I think about the potential here, it's the non-zero sum mindset. This is going to allow us to produce and do much more with the same amount of resources that we had before. And therefore, we can raise people's standard of living because we're able to do this.
Yeah.
So even like, you take AI, I think it's probably under discussing the advent of generalist robotics, because now we're going to be able to have machines that can actually observe the world around them and process data in a short enough period of time that they can become like generalist machines. And this is probably something that's going to happen over the next year.
We've been talking about like how long until a robot can lay a brick on one of our construction sites.
So like, you could do the same amount of things you were doing before, or you could do a lot more things. And I think if you have a competitive economy where there's competition between firms, like, I could choose to lay people off because I have made their jobs redundant through processes. But what if my competitor invests in training them to do more of the sticky parts of this that were before?
Sure.
And we do more. Well, then someone's going to come eat your lunch with their labor. And so I do think that we have a tendency to overdoom. And so what we need to focus on is like, how do we actually help people through that transition? And I don't think it does us any favors when we make AI all about the doom it's going to cause in the labor market and not about actually, this could be an enormous driver of jobs and investment and actually make us richer and better off to begin with.
Yeah.
And I actually think that scenario is far more likely if we get things right than, you know, the downside risks of like mass layoffs and all these other things.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I asked the question being extremely optimistic about all of this. I just see it as like, you know, massive productivity improvements, and yeah, like how do you get ahead of that? How do you think about like any institutional change that is required, and just like to the extent that there is more flexibility and dynamism in an economy, that process of creative destruction goes faster, and you get to the other side of the change faster.
Yeah. So like to me, I think the consumer is undervalued in politics because they don't really have the ability to lobby on behalf of their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
So like let's take the anger that we see about grocery prices, and everyone's saying, oh, like there's an oligopoly in grocery, like, and grocery prices are rising, and it's like, yes, like they're all big bad monopolies. And it's like, okay, but what if you break it down, what provides grocery chains some of their monopoly power? And number one, it's the fact either they often own the commercial plazas that they're a part of, or they're the anchor tenant. And typically in the agreements that they have, if any other business in that location opens up, they are prohibited from selling similar products at below prices. Okay, well, and then when you've designed our land use around having really highly localized commercial plazas rather than, you know, the ability to like start small and like a neighborhood retail where you're kind of like a fruit stand and you're kind of going on. So that's why you can see like Spadina, if you go to a grocery store that's like independent and Chinese owned, and they're getting their food from the food terminal, on the lakeshore, oftentimes you can get things for half the price. Well, that's because there's a lot of competition in that area and people have options. Whereas effectively a Loblaws in the area it operates has a bit of a monopoly power.
For like a 1-2 kilometer radius. Yeah.
Right. And then there's no outlet for new market entrants in that area either.
Yeah.
So, you know, you look at the dairy and poultry supply management system that we have that raises prices 40%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's 15 to 25% of the average cart for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that part of the solution here is understanding why so many of our markets are uncompetitive, and improving productivity will also mean addressing those competition problems. And in many ways, addressing them will also set us up to both adopt some of this new technology faster, but also so that it doesn't disrupt so many jobs because, you know, if you do not use that additional capacity to do more things, your competitor might.
Yeah. No, it's good. When do you formally announce? Or what are the rules? What's the deadline for being in or out?
Yeah. So the deadline for becoming an approved candidate with the party is July 31st.
Yeah.
The official start is June 3rd.
Okay.
July 3rd. But for me in particular, I think I'm going to stay in a discovery phase, probably through March and April, make sure that both my machine is built and that fundraising and all of this stuff, there's confidence that I can make it to the end.
Right.
So we'll have a go, no-go decision sometime probably around early May.
Yeah.
And then we'll see from there.
And I think this has come up, or at least you've raised it. You're relatively young, not necessarily the only person who's relatively young going into this race. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, like, is that a complete anomaly in Ontario history and even the Liberal Party? As I think about it, I think there are a couple of prominent Liberal leaders that were quite young when they started their lives in politics.
You do have Peterson, who ran for leadership, I think at the age of 31 or 32. In his defense, and I guess to my discredit, he had a seat when he ran for this. So I recognize what I'm doing.
Short-lived premier, if I remember right. One term.
One term, yes. Yeah. So look, like I do think
McGinty was also quite in his 30s when he first ran, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like I do think that there's like given the field, I do think that there is a path for my kind of message and disposition, because I'm more willing to embrace what I'd call productive controversy than I think some of the other candidates might be, and that I'm willing to go a little bit further on the vision and the proposals in order to stoke debate that I think that we need. And then I also do believe that there's an advantage to being young in the sense that, I've gotten some advice. Young people don't show up. So like you shouldn't really focus on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, well, when's the last time I saw someone put forward a platform that I genuinely thought was trying to be in the interests of young people? Like I can't really think of one other than I think maybe Justin Trudeau's 2015
With the weed
campaign. The truth is, like, young people turned out
yeah, they did
in that election for Trudeau. And so like I do think that I'll probably have a more explicit generational agenda as well.
You need to figure out what your weed topic is.
I guess it's housing, which is maybe better than weed.
It's not even just housing. Like I think what you'll find is like my mortal enemy is this milestone recession.
Yeah.
And so I want young people to get their financial footing far earlier in life than they do today.
Yeah.
And, it's going to require trade-offs. But I think ultimately making the case that these trade-offs are needed in order to ensure this generation does not fail to launch, I think will be a compelling argument. And I hope I'll have the opportunity to really present it.
And probably compelling to their parents as well, who would also like to see their kids launch, right?
Yeah.
So I think actually it is multi-generational in many ways. That's great. Where should people tune in to see more, learn more, get involved?
Yeah. So go to ericforoop.ca. On there, you can sign up, but also you can schedule a meeting with me. So I kind of do office hours several times a week. So people just join, they bring their questions that they have. And in many cases, we're finding that's a great way to like recruit volunteers and other interests. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty committed to making myself the most accessible leadership candidate in this race. Or you can follow me on X, Eric D. Lombardi. The same is true on my fledgling but growing TikTok, at Eric Lombardi on Instagram as well.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.